Welcome back. This is day two of prepping the France topic. I want to start each day with like some strategic insights. I don't want this all to just be prep. So I have some argument ideas today. It'll start super stock and super basic, and then hopefully it'll become more and more nuanced throughout the topic as it progresses. So I'm starting with the most basic stuff. So escalation with Russia on the con. I think this will be incredibly common as an argument. The argument is just that when the EU and France increased their militarization, presumably also closer to Russia, considering that most of the other countries that we would be sharing nukes with are probably more Eastern than France. You will have some incentives from Russia to respond in some sort of tit for tat fashion that creates more dangers, more potential for miscalculation, and more bad things in general. Maybe in some way Russia will punish the EU for doing this. In order to understand this argument, we have to really dig into the incentives and capacity of Russia as an actor. So, what incentives does Putin have to decide to do all of these things? I think most of these incentives actually come from like catering to his domestic political audience. If we're thinking about what Putin actually wants, there are kind of two possible, maybe three possible dimensions in which we can analyze this. One dimension is like Putin wants to survive and to continue his hold on power. In order for him to do that, there's a specific base of people in Russia. It's not really the whole public, it's not a democracy. There's a specific base of people in Russia that he has to cater to and keep the support of in order to stay in power. So that looks like the military, maybe like the Russian oligarchs who maintain most of the economy, things like that, right? Those are the leaders in Russia that Putin needs to keep the support of, or at least not like really anger in order to continue his hold on power. Second dimension is that Putin, like, he's a person. Maybe he wants specific things himself. Like psychologically, he wants this like return to empire. And that's like a personal motivation of his, perhaps, that could be an incentive. And that's one way of explaining it, at least. A third dimension is like, what does Putin know is important for Russia as like an actor in terms of the security dimensions? This is more of a realist stance on like what Russia's incentives are. So, for example, one incentive here would be if Russia does not respond to a NATO or EU escalation, then Russia might look weak. It might seem to other enemies, including NATO, but other enemies as well, that they can get away with escalations against Russia or slights against Russia without Russia responding in kind. And that would send a signal to other adversaries of Russia that maybe they should get away with more of this kind of stuff that is against Russian interests, which in turn might hurt Russian interests. So there's like a realist argument that Russian security interests and national interests are not favored by inaction in the face of escalation from the EU, which means instead they will use their capacities, whatever they have, things like cyber attacks, propaganda, maybe even physical strikes to respond probably in a very visible way, visible to the public in Russia and visible to other countries and other actors in the international security arena. And that might be bad, right? We might get like escalation, miscalculation, you name it, bad things will happen. The pro argument is about assurances. This is like, um, there's a deterrence argument on the pro that's very straightforward. It's just like, we need to prevent Russia from attacking, and a French nuclear sharing agreement will achieve that. There's also an assurance argument on the pro, which is that there are lots of different allies who would be involved or calmed down, assured by a French nuclear sharing arrangement, who otherwise might feel panicked and act on that panic in worse ways. So the strategic idea here is like we know that a lot of the con arguments are going to be centered around this link about escalating with Russia. So it might be strategic for the pro to find a way to turn that using the comparative. So maybe there's an even greater escalation if we don't do the French nuclear sharing arrangement. And this will instead act as kind of a de-escalatory measure compared to the likely counterfactual or the likely comparative, right? Some examples are Poland, the Baltics, and Germany, who all might do things like increase their conventional forces more, maybe even go for their own nuclear deterrent, or even just feel greater insecurity and act on that greater insecurity with more miscalculation, more red alert stationing, etc. More things that make you more prone to accidents and miscalculation, and therefore conflict. And they might be calmed down relatively more by the presence of a French nuclear sharing arrangement, which then, at least to some extent, solves this problem. So those are the strategic argument ideas for today. In terms of the prep, I cut, I guess, 10 pages of cards. We have an argument on the con here that it is going to be escalatory, that we shouldn't respond to Russia's nuclear sharing with Belarus. We have a big card that I cut about just like who's who in the French 2027 elections, which are very far away. So this card is mostly speculation, but it's good to know about the internal politics in France. Then we have this card that says the French extended deterrent is really bad. It gives a million reasons it's not going to work. It's very heavy-handed. It also like advocates for pro-lift, so like you take it with a grain of salt. But the interesting part I found is this part. It says like it's a bad thing because it would give France more weight in Europe. It says America acted as the umbrella. It stayed away, which allowed Europe to unite. So I guess maybe it's implying that if France has more weight instead, then it will divide Europe in some way. That might, it says it's not necessarily terrible, but it might be an interesting link or a launching point for other research on like the politics of Europe as an argument from this topic. The next article, and you'll see a trend here that a lot of these ones, I've been doing background research, but like most of the background research starts to lean con just because I think most people are not pro authors on this topic. This card says France is certainly not proposing any sharing. So if you've read any articles that say that they are, I think those are misunderstanding Macron's statements. And it says that the current model is preferable for the states that would be recipients. Here, Poland and other NATO countries, the current model remains optimal, though we could have some other slight changes that would increase its deterrent capability even more. But these are below the threshold of nuclear sharing. And maybe they're even general practical solutions, or they're just like likely outcomes of the status quo trend, especially if Russia continues to escalate. This one I couldn't read because there was a paywall, but it looks promising. It's like an official study in academic literature that looks through all of the rhetoric of like speeches from politicians in France across a few years, specifically about Europeanization of the French nuclear deterrent. So it might be interesting if you're running like a French politics scenario, get some good context from this if you can find a way around the paywall. Here we have a big backgrounder on like all of the French nuclear capabilities, the doctrines and stuff. It goes a bit deeper than the stuff that was in my card dump earlier. So really good to know about. And then we have this debate in the UN. This is just like a press release about Russian nuclear sharing with Belarus, basically right after it happened. And some people said that it violates the NPT. Some people said that it didn't. Some people say that it's the same as NATO, whatever. Either way, this might thump any NPT link on the con. Like the NPT link would be like French nuclear sharing with the EU violates the NPT, which hurts the NPT in some way. If this is already happening with Belarus, so why didn't we see the impact, right? So it might be interesting defense that you can cut as well. The last thing that I wanted to share is a big like prep file from when I was prepping a few years ago on the NATO defense commitments to the Baltic states topic, which I was reminded of the topic as I started prepping and thinking about this one because they're very similar. They both have this escalation deterrence debate that's sort of foundational. They're both about Russia. They're both about most of the same countries that are in both the EU and NATO. And about like collective defense as well. So this is all very old prep because it's from a few years ago. So you would need to update it, but it gives you just some bonus ideas. They won't all fit because they're all very specific to the Baltics and NATO, but some of them will. Like a lot of these pieces of evidence are quite general. I can't take credit for all of this. I think I cut most of these cards, probably the vast majority, but this was with a handful of other people as well. But it's been a long time since that topic, so I hope they won't mind me sharing it a little bit. So I'll attach a link to this in the description of the video as well. Hopefully this can give you some inspiration or maybe it will be helpful. I also have a bunch of other Baltics prep. If people found this helpful, then I can share some other cases and stuff that I wrote for like demo rounds at camps, and that might also assist you.